I would like now to give the floor to Gurminder for presentation, but I would like to spend a few minutes presenting you. She is a professor of sociology at the University of Warwick. For the academic year 2014-15, she was visiting fellow in the Department of Sociology, Princeton University, and visitor at the Institute for Advanced Study, Princeton. Her research interests are primarily in the area of historical sociology and contemporary social theory. And she's also interested in the intersection of the social sciences with recent work in postcolonial and decolonial studies. Gurminder is the author of Connected Sociologies. This is the title of this book published in 2014, and Rethinking Modernity, Postcolonialism and the Sociological Imagination, just to speak about sociological imagination, which won a few years ago the Philip Abrams Memorial Prize for Best First Book in Sociology. She has co-edited several collections, and she also set up the Global Social Theory website for those interested in social theory in global perspective. So, yours is the floor.
Thank you. And thank you again for the invitation to speak here today, and to all of you for staying for this final closing plenary. The title of my presentation is Postcolonial Reconstructions of Europe. And I'll start by outlining the political context that forms the basis of this talk. I mean, it would be surprising if anybody here has missed the migrant crisis or tragedy that's currently playing out on and within the borders of Europe. There are the horrific death tolls increasing every week in the Mediterranean, over 2,000 already this year, and projected by the International Organization of Migration to rise substantially by the end of the year. Then there's the appalling conditions of the camps for those who do make it across. The camp at Calais, for example, has been labeled as an intolerable humanitarian scandal and a civil emergency by the United Nations. And just a couple of weeks ago, hundreds of people were locked in a football stadium on the island of Kos, Greece, for over 24 hours without access to food, water, or shade. Then there's the language used by our political classes to describe those who come. In the UK, for example, our Prime Minister has described these people as a swarm. Politicians have talked about being under siege, and barely veiled metaphors of cleanliness and hygiene have been used from Sweden to France to Italy to the Czech Republic to discuss this crisis. The crisis, I suggest, is both visible and invisible. You likely know about the crisis, and so it's visible. Imagine, however, if those 2,000 plus black and brown bodies being washed up on the shores of the northern Mediterranean were white. Would the outrage be stronger, more vociferous? Would we be lobbying our governments to do more to help these people, rather than to do more to keep them out? Would we be holding regular candlelit vigils and be wearing badges that said, "Je suis un réfugié"? Would we be more worried about preserving our living standards in the face of marauding migrants than wondering what they may contribute, and what they may already have contributed to our very ability to enjoy the lives we lead? In the talk today, I'm not going to address the migrant crisis directly. There are people much better qualified than me to speak on that topic, and many of them are here at this conference. But I do want you to think about it. I want you to have it in the back of your mind throughout the talk. It is the political context for what I will be speaking about, and that is the necessary, and I would suggest the urgent, post-colonial reconstruction of Europe. Jürgen Habermas, one of the most prominent and respected commentators on the question of Europe, has consistently sought to define the normative and political projects of Europe. One of the key questions for him has been how citizens within the European Union could be made to understand themselves as citizens of the European Union. This transfiguration is presented as necessary for the establishment of a political culture that would subsequently enable political action by the European Union. For example, to implement policies of redistribution and to ensure acceptable levels of social security across constituent member states. Habermas's concerns about growing economic inequality within and across European states is also accompanied by fears about the threats to social peace that are posed by the turn to right-wing populism, particularly in the context of austerity. He's concerned about the proposed alliance that has been presented by far-right groups whose aim is to dismantle the European project in favour of a return to national autonomy. As a consequence, in advance of last year's European elections, he was involved in a collective statement organised by the late Ulrich Beck, putting forward the case for the continuation of the European project through a stronger European Union. The problems of atavism associated with far-right activity within Europe were seen to be addressed through arguments for a stronger European Union. So in effect, within this collective statement, what Habermas, Beck and the other public intellectuals were writing was to make an argument for the EU. In their terms, it was more Europe, not less Europe. But this was done, however, without saying anything about the substance of the far-right's hostility to multiculturalism or their calls for a reduction in immigration. So the only way in which these intellectuals sought to deal with the rise of the far right was simply to counter their wish to break up the European Union and not actually address issues of migration, which was another key aspect of what the far right were talking about at the time and since. Immigration, immigrants, multiculturalism are not terms to be found in the collective statement or in the individual contributions of Europe's public intellectuals. Indeed, about the only mention of migrants comes in Beck's rhetorical question, castigating Europeans who wish less Europe, about whether the European dream is only to be carried by those in crowded refugee boats in the Mediterranean. Their message to us, he exhorts, is that Europe is more than a fiscal union. It is the hope of freedom, democracy, and openness to the world. That openness, perhaps, is put in question if, instead of starting with the dreams of those in crowded refugee boats, we started from the corpses of many of those very refugees piling up on the northern Mediterranean shoreline. The silence of Europe's public intellectuals on their plight derives precisely from an absence of the openness that is otherwise lauded. This silence, as I will go on to suggest, is not an individual lapse, but is systematically produced in most accounts of Europe. And we, as scholars, are as complicit as those political commentators in rendering peripheral the lives and experiences of those who may look other, but are nonetheless as European as you or me. The European project, given institutional form as the EEC and then the EU, came about in its own understanding as a consequence of European states wishing to make amends for the recent past. A recent past that had seen 2 world wars and the genocide perpetrated by the fascist regime in Austro-Hungary occur on European soil. The European project was not to create a single state, but a common framework within which national differences could coexist without murderous intent. The associated intellectual project was organized around the idea of cosmopolitan Europe, a Europe that would distance itself from its recent past by uniting in recognition of its deeper, long-standing institutional commonalities and celebrating its cultural diversity within those commonalities. Diversity in this context, however, refers only to the linguistic and cultural diversity seen to exist between states within the European Union. There is very little discussion of the diversity within states as part of this same conceptualization of cosmopolitan Europe. This articulation of cosmopolitanism rests on a particular understanding of European history that evades acknowledging European domination over much of the rest of the world as significant to that history. It also disavows examining the consequences of that domination for the very contemporary multicultural constitution of European societies. Cosmopolitanism in these terms acknowledges national differences within a common European cultural framework, and at the same time posits its European cultural difference from those non-European others that are associated with the diversity that constitutes multiculturalism. The cosmopolitan cultural diversity of Europe, then, is counterposed to that constituted by and through multicultural others. These others are presumed to import their diversity into and against the cultural diversity already present within Europe. How precisely these differences are understood and recognized as cosmopolitan differences or multicultural differences is not clear, except insofar as they map onto some notion of visible, that is, racialized, or then more recently, religious difference. Habermas's association of multiculturalism with what he calls, and I quote, postcolonial immigrant societies, for example, demonstrates a parochial understanding that limits the postcolonial to those others who migrate to Europe. And in the process, it renders invisible the long-standing histories that connect those migrants with Europe and as European. In this way, the issues that reference to the postcolonial signifies are seen as beginning with immigration and carried by the non-European other. And in contrast, what I would wish to argue is that we need to understand Europe itself as postcolonial, not in the sense of being beyond colonialism, but the postcolonial as a provocation to think Europe's colonial history as constitutive of its postcolonial present. Some of you may be aware of the comments made recently by the UK's Foreign Secretary Philip Hammond when he talked about marauding migrants coming to Europe and threatening our quality of life. I just want to give you his full quote. He says, "The gap in standards of living between Europe and Africa means there will always be millions of Africans with the economic motivation to try to get to Europe. So long as there are large numbers of pretty desperate migrants marauding around the area, there will always be a threat to the tunnel security. Europe can't protect itself, preserve its standard of living and social infrastructure if it has to absorb millions of migrants from Africa." In a similar vein, Habermas has suggested that the painful transition to post-colonial immigrant societies within Europe is occurring alongside, and I quote, "the humiliating conditions of growing social inequality, which is associated with the pressures of globalized labor markets." While the tone of the two statements may be different, in both, multicultural migrants are implicitly presented as responsible for the decline of the welfare and social settlement within Europe and for increasing social and economic inequality there as well. There is no discussion of the desperate conditions elsewhere that force people to migrate. Conditions historically created, for the most part, by European colonial powers. The gap in living standards is not a natural gap. You don't have poor countries and rich countries as a natural phenomenon within the world. That gap is produced. The economic motivation that drives poorer people to migrate has been produced and continues to be reproduced by policies emanating from richer countries. Europe's higher standard of living and its extensive social infrastructure has not been established or maintained separate from the labor and wealth of others, or then from the creation of misery elsewhere. Those who come are labeled as migrants or refugees, or worse. And they are presented as being responsible for destroying the living conditions of European citizens and the social infrastructure of European nations. They are not seen as being constitutive of Europe's own self-understanding or as legitimate beneficiaries of the post-war social settlement. Any attempt to address these issues would need to start by recognizing that labeling people crossing the Mediterranean as migrants or refugees is itself part of the problem. Migrants and refugees, by definition, are excluded from the history of the state, which is understood in national terms, and thus they're excluded from the history of belonging to the political community that enjoys rights and claims upon that state. This exclusion from the history of belonging is then used to justify exclusion in the present from entry to those states and from sharing in its wealth and resources. Maintaining a distinction between migrant, refugee on the one hand and citizen on the other, however, is based on an erroneous historical understanding that separates states from colonies. In contrast, as I will go on to argue, we need to understand the contemporary crisis in the context of connected histories that bring states and colonies within a single political and analytical frame. And it's this question of boundaries, both historical and contemporary, and between migrant and citizen, that's precisely what has been at issue within postcolonial historiography. While this turn may be a relatively recent turn, the arguments that have been made within it are not, but they've had insufficient purchase within European sociology. These arguments, in effect, have sought an acknowledgement of how Europe's posited others have always been a part of Europe's broader histories, and as such have argued for a reconsideration of how these others are treated within European societies and polities. And it's to this, to the post-colonial reconstruction of understandings of Europe, that I now turn. In terms of scholarship on the historical evolution of European integration, the dominant narrative has tended to be one of Europe as a project of peace. And indeed, I've been to a number of presentations here at this conference where the idea of the EU as a project of peace has been central to the arguments that are being made. And in the wider world, this was consolidated with an award in 2012 of the Nobel Peace Prize to the EU. I would suggest that this mythology effaces the history of European domination in the past, as well as exclusions of both territories and citizens in the present. And as P.O. Hansen argues, for example, such an identification, i.e. of the EU being a project of peace, can only come about to the extent that violence in the European colonies is separated out as being of a different order to that occurring within the boundaries of Europe itself. So the whole idea of the EU as a project of peace starts from the idea that after the Second World War, there has been no war between European states and no violence within Europe of that sort of magnitude. However, P.O. Hansen points to the Algerian War, 1954 to 62, which resulted in the deaths of over 1 million people and engaged approximately 500,000 French troops. Hansen argues that not even a sizable war fought within the European economic community has been able to impinge on the notion of European integration as a symbol of peace. And this, despite the fact that Algeria entered the EEC in 1957 on much the same basis as France. The only difference being that Algerian workers were not free to move between the member countries, and nor were they to receive wages or social insurance at European rates. In this way, we can see that the European project has been both a colonial project and a racial project from its very outset. The displacement of this violence from the narrative of the emergence of the European polity is a consequence of a disjunctive translation of identity, where France is seen to be European, Algeria is presented as French, but is not then recognized as European. And it's this maneuver that enables the violence in Algeria not to be recognized as occurring within the European polity, even when the war was one of independence from France and, as such, from the European project itself. In the process, the fiction of the substance of Europe as peaceable is maintained, as is the fiction of European boundaries as congruent with a particular geographical representation. Further, Pio Hansen and Stefan Jonsson, in their timely project Eurafrica, argue that the post-war period that saw the negotiations that ultimately led to the development or the establishment of the EEC was one in which parts of Africa and the common market were bound together in one imperial polity. The negotiations for European integration, they argue, were predicated on the very idea of bringing Africa as a dowry to Europe. That's what Charles de Gaulle said in the context of the discussions around establishing the EEC. So not only were the African colonies of European states unquestionably put at the service of the incipient European project, but there was a stronger statement, and this I'm quoting from Hansen and Jonsson, that Europe's unification could succeed only if it also was fashioned as a joint colonization of Africa. The issue here is not, and I just want to repeat this, it's not just that there were colonies brought into the European project by the individual member states, but that the European project itself was predicated on the idea of the joint colonization of Africa as a European endeavor. While the self-understanding of Europe has traditionally sought to make colonialism the past property of individual states, so if any of you have ever looked at the website of the European Union, I think it's called Europa, it presents the history of the EU. And the history of the EU effectively starts in 1947 and then goes on after that. And the idea of colonialism, that a number of the states that were the original members were actually colonial states. That's all left behind as part of the history of the nation. And what's talked about is simply the joining together of the nation states. And so what I want to sort of suggest here is that in such an understanding, there are at least two errors. The first, as I've just highlighted, is that colonialism was a phenomenon that was also integral to the European project. That is, that we cannot understand the European project outside of its own colonial ambitions and intent. And then second, and this is what I want to focus on next, is that the countries that came to constitute the EEC also did have colonies. But what's significant is not only that they had colonies, but that they were colonial states. So the European project is not a project that's made up of the coming together of nation states. It's a project that's made up of the coming together of colonial states, and that has an impact on the way in which we should understand Europe and European values subsequently. One of the consequences of treating the construction of the EU as a transnational project, and moreover as a transnational project that sought to draw a line under the recent past, is that in the process, it constructs national paths for European states when those states were in fact imperial states. Imperial states themselves constituted as transnational projects of empire and colonialism. So looking at 4 of the original 6 members, we see that Algeria was an integral part of France, and France also controlled a number of other colonies in Africa. Italy controlled parts of Somaliland, Belgium controlled the Congo, Netherlands controlled Suriname, and a number of Caribbean islands. With the accession of Spain, Britain, and Portugal over the next couple of decades, the idea that it was nation states that were joining together is demonstrated as a clear fiction, given the extent of overseas territories that these countries also brought with them. The EU was established by the coming together of colonial states and constituted itself in colonial terms. Yet colonialism is rarely mentioned in discussions of the EU. Specifically, the failure to properly account for Europe's colonial past cements the political division between legitimate citizens with membership rights and migrants and refugees without rights. So if partly what I'm wishing to point to here is that how we narrate the history of Europe's past has a consequence in terms of how we engage with the politics of the present. And to not recognize Europe's colonial past is to present people today as without rights, when if we narrated our past differently, we would recognize that they had rights. If belonging to the history of the nation is what traditionally confers rights upon individuals, as most forms of citizenship demonstrate, then I argue that it is incumbent upon us to recognize the wider histories that would see migrants, refugees, as already having claims upon the states they wish to enter. And it is this that it would enable different ways of addressing the crises that we currently face. How much time do I have? Okay, great. So what I want to do is work towards a conclusion by exploring in a little more detail the case of the UK. Now, I recognize that the nature of colonial entanglements across Europe and European states are complicated and that they're different across those states. But I'd really like to encourage us to think about what could be learnt across cases and by examining connections between cases. And what I want to do by looking at the UK and its history is really to challenge the idea of the political community as a national political order. This is an idea, I suggest, that has been central not only to European self-understanding, but also has framed European historical sociology. And in challenging those ideas, I want to argue for the post-colonial reconstruction of Europe, but also the post-colonial reconstruction of sociology as one aspect of this broader endeavour. So if we think about Britain, Britain as a nation state usually is seen to emerge in 1707 with the Act of Union that brought together the kingdoms of England and Scotland. Its political development is seen to be predominantly in terms of events and processes that took place within the territorial bounds of this new state. However, both England and Scotland, independently, had acquired colonies prior to Union, and they continued their colonial conquests after Union. So England and Scotland were already imperial states prior to becoming a nation state and alongside this process. Empire, however, is very rarely presented as significant for understanding the history or contemporary society of the state, and this has particular exclusionary consequences. For example, one of the processes of post-war reconstructions of citizenship is to transform those who were once subjects of empire, albeit delimited in rights, to citizens of new states with no claims upon previous political authorities, and in many cases with problematic status in those new states. So from being subjects with claims within a wider imperial polity, they became migrants within the lands in which they resided, or then refugees from them. Just to give you two examples, Indian subjects of British Empire who lived in East Africa during the period of decolonization were effectively left stateless when, upon decolonization in these states, Britain refused to allow them entry to the UK. India also refused to allow them entry because they were not deemed to be Indian citizens because they weren't living in India. The UK then argued for them to be classed as refugees under UN jurisdiction. This despite the fact that the majority of these Indian subjects had gone to East Africa not as Indian subjects, but as British subjects, holding British passports and working for the British Empire in a variety of outposts. However, when they wished to go to Britain, they were denied it on the basis of not being subjects, even though they were. Similarly, British subjects in the West Indies who answered the call for workers and labourers in the post-war reconstruction of Britain were treated as immigrants and not as subject citizens upon arrival in the UK. They came understanding themselves as subjects of British Empire, but the ways in which they were treated once they entered Britain were certainly not as people who had rights. The refusal to acknowledge as citizens those people who had previously been subjects of empire is what is at issue here. And this is a consequence of continuing to think about Britain as a nation state. If we were to understand the state instead as an imperial state, this would mean that we would also need to acknowledge the varied and diverse social and political communities that made up the British Empire and to recognise the claims of those communities to citizenship and rights within Britain today. By recognising the history of the state as a multicultural history, we would then be able to address contemporary issues of multicultural citizenship and belonging. The current wealth and prosperity of Britain let alone of Europe, but I'm focusing on Britain here, the current wealth and prosperity of Britain is due in no small part to its imperial activities as expressed through enslavement, dispossession, extraction, and the domination of populations understood as British subjects within the empire. The arrival in Britain of those who were formerly subjects of empire is seen to be a problem by those already living in Britain. The new arrivals are framed as migrants without legitimate claims on the resources of the British state, and indeed the state, through its political representatives, seeks to exclude them and to deny their claims to be treated as equals and as citizens with rights. I've been making the argument that what we need to do is consider the relationship between empire and state and to acknowledge its continuity into the present. And I want to end with a demonstration to you that at the end of the 19th century, the British state was empire, and empire was the British state. In 1884, Richard Temple, president of the Economic Science and Statistics section of the Royal Statistical Society, gave an address on, the title was, The General Statistics of the British Empire. In this address, he stated that the annual revenue collected in the British Empire for the general administration of the state amounted to 203 million sterling, of which 89 million came from the UK, 74 million came from India, and 40 million came from other colonies and dependencies. That is over half of the annual revenue of the British national government came from the labour and resources of those within its empire beyond the national state. There was an additional tax levied on those populations for local purposes. So this wasn't the tax that was then used to spend on projects within the empire and the colonies. This was tax that was levied simply for use by the British government in Britain for its national purposes. The population of empire, he continues, was 305 to perhaps 315 millions of souls, all of whom were regarded as British subjects. We're not really citizens in Britain, we're subjects. So if being a citizen, being a subject of empire or being a subject of the state is quite similar. By adding together earnings and other sources of wealth from across the populations of the empire, that is from British subjects and those subject to British rule, Temple was able confidently to state, and I quote, that this empire is the richest state on the face of the earth. Could there be a clearer statement that the British Empire and the British state are one, and that the populations of empire contributed significantly for the wealth that was then appropriated for national ends? Obviously, Richard Temple is expressing his political arithmetic to an elite audience, an audience who would have understood that unity. Now, however, the situation is rather different. The complex historical processes that I've discussed, albeit briefly, are frequently neutralized within sociological discourse and political commentary. This failure, the failure to acknowledge the multicultural histories of colonialism and empire as pertinent to our understandings of the contemporary political state and the contemporary European project, are having increasingly serious political repercussions. This is evidenced not only by the migrant crisis as it's currently being played out, but also in terms of the debates on immigration and migration across the European Union are demonstrating. The general claim about them coming here, taking away our jobs and our homes, reducing our quality of life. These claims have a long history in Europe, and they're regaining political significance today. The distinction between them and us, between migrants, refugees, and citizens, this distinction is only sustainable to the extent that we fail to acknowledge the histories that bring us together. The earlier political claim that we are here because you were there continues to be a necessary assertion in contemporary struggles for social and political equality. If we want a different Europe in the present and the future, then we need to narrate the colonial past of its constituent countries and the implications of that colonial past into the very project of Europe itself. We need to acknowledge the imperial past as the very condition of possibility of Europe and European countries today, with all the rights, duties, and obligations to reparatory justice that entails. Thank you.